Hopefully you can see the slides all right on Teams, and you can hear me okay. I won't know if you can't, so I guess we'll see what happens. My name is Jamie, and I work at the University of Essex. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is I thought we'd spend about half an hour going over regression analysis. No, not really. Gosh, there was some scared looks in the audience.
Simple linear?
Yes, we'll be doing that. So I'm going to talk to you about quantitative analysis, but I was joking on the break that I'm an ethnographer, sort of, by training, and then when I hear proper ethnographers, like Poppy talking, I realise maybe I'm not an ethnographer. And mostly what I do is qualitative analysis of one sort or another, but I've also spent some time thinking about quantitative data in the video games industry, and this is what I'm going to talk to you about today. And then I have a couple of activities, not regression related, that we're going to do during the talk. But what I wanted to start off with, and this is the kind of opposite of regression analysis maybe, although maybe Marx spent some time doing regression analysis, is to make an argument with you about what Marx has to say about video games or about quantitative analysis. Now, of course, Marx had nothing to say about video games, given when he was alive, but he did like games. One of the things that Marx did when he finally finished volume 1 of Capital was treated himself to a game of chess with a friend, and of course he won. I have no real idea how that went. And what Marx has to say about quantitative analysis, because we often think about Marx not being interested in kind of hard data as such, but more as engaging in kind of broader forms of analysis. And I wrote a book about Marxism and video games, which was really an attempt to play more video games, but maybe all of us can relate to the difficulty of finding time to do that whilst being an academic. And so I want to make a bit of an argument about how we can think about data, or how we should think about data from a perspective like this. And in part, one of the reasons to think about this is we're constantly bombarded with data about video games. The Statista reports, which of course the methodology isn't open, so it's hard to know exactly what's happening with data, are constantly telling us that basically everyone in the world is always playing video games, or more importantly, everybody in the world might buy your video game. So we're bombarded with kind of corporate data telling us about how much more money games make than films or music or these sorts of things. And some of the data can be a little bit overwhelming. I realise there's a potentially also ethnographic moment of revealing the first bit of your Steam page and seeing which games you've bought or not. Luckily, it doesn't have any more data about how much some of these have been played. But there are so many games being released that we are, in a sense, drowning in different forms of data about the video games industry. And so one of the things that I first started doing when I wrote about video games, I wrote a paper in 2015, 2016 about the video games industry and about working conditions in the games industry. And at the time, there were a number of different data sources, quantitative data sources, that you could have a look at to try and understand what was happening in the industry. How many of you have ever come across the developer satisfaction survey? Okay, one. It's a start. So the IGDA, which is not quite what it sounds, it's more a kind of employers association in lots of ways, has commissioned regular surveys of game developers. And Joanna Westar, people know Joanna's work at Western, is one of the academics who's involved with this. And this, for a long time, has tried to collect quantitative data about what it's like to work in the video games industry. You might not be surprised, although the latest isn't out, 2021 is, that one of the things that features heavily in the data are discussions around crunch, around overwork, the number of people who expect to do this, expect to have high levels of crunch time, working long hours not defined as crunch, or 60 to 90 hour weeks. So we can get the beginnings of glimpses through quantitative data about something that we probably all know is an issue in the industry, right? Long working hours. And of course, part of this is what kinds of questions get asked in surveys like this. You know, how we define long working hours, you know, how we think of it as an issue, why we might want to inquire into it in one way or another. But one of the things that I want to start, and this is where we're going to do our first activity, is one of the questions that I get asked quite a lot about the video games industry in Britain is how many people work in the games industry? Now this should be an obvious figure to be able to get. And so what I want you to do, let's say 5 minutes or so, is see if you can find the number of people who work in the video games industry in Britain. Could be an obvious thing, right? You know something about the video games industry, you know how many companies there are.
None, because it's not work.
None, because it's not work. Okay, well we have answer number one. Let's see if you can find some other statistics about the games industry. How many people, maybe how many companies, and then we'll compare some of the stats and have a think about what it might be. Make sense to everyone? But how does the labour force survey define video game work?
Well, that's what I'm trying to find out. $43,000.
Okay, we have answer number one, 43,000, which is also on the screen. So if you've been Googling for that figure, there was a hint already up there.
I've got 20,975 full-time employment in the game industry.
Okay, so we have a full-time employment figure. Is anybody else getting any other kinds of figures?
That figure was from 2016.
2021 from Statista, 43,000.
Oh yeah, but 2020 was from 2016.
Ah, okay.
Is that not from the 2022 report?
That's what I found.
So it says full-time employees, so that might suggest there are other kinds of workers, part-time, freelancers.
Would it be right? Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I was going to ask, would this be an industry where there's a kind of a large sector of ghost work? I don't know, but I would assume that it would be.
What do we think? And what do you mean by ghost work? Maybe
So ghost work in the sense of how Gray and Surrey defined it, because they mainly looked at Amazon's Mechanical Turk, which is the people who do kind of very, very loosely defined, very impromptu ad hoc labor from basically all over the world. And so they're not really tracked by any one country's employment statistics.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm assuming, because video games is a technical, it would be a lot of that.
Yep, so there might be other kinds of work happening that aren't accounted for in some of these statistics. Was that a hand? No.
No,
Okay. Any other figures we've come up with? Yeah.
What do we class like who like employ innocent companies? What do we class like indie developers who make their own games?
Yeah. So there are a number of problems with trying to find data on the video games industry. The first is a definitional problem. What counts as working in the video games industry? What roles do we consider to be part of it? What roles do we not? If you found the labour force data, it doesn't have the video games industry as a sector. And so lots of the national data will fold video games into other sectors. Sometimes into creative sectors of various kinds, sometimes into high-tech work of various kinds. There is a problem of thinking about full-time employees versus part-time. Indies pose a massive problem because in Britain, under a certain size, companies have no reporting requirements. They don't have to say how many people they employ. They don't have to say what kind of budgets they have and so on. There's another problem, which is perhaps the most profitable video game, well, no, it is the most profitable video game ever made, was made in Britain, was made in Scotland. Grand Theft Auto technically was made in Edinburgh. Of course, it wasn't made in Edinburgh, right? It was made all over the world in different studios with subcontracting relationships, some of which might be more equivalent to these kinds of ghost work. Is there's a problem of trying to account nationally for how an industry operates that is increasingly a globalized industry. So trying to count these statistics and data and trying to figure out how many people are involved or aren't is actually quite a big question. I've previously done research on call centers. You would think call centers would be an industry you could understand better in Britain. There are around 1 million people that work in call centers, something like this. But even things like that can be difficult to draw out national data on. It is significantly more than 43,000 people. That's perhaps a bit of an aside. There are a number of different attempts to look into this, different surveys and censuses that attempt to understand what's happening in the video game industry. One of these is the UK Games Industry Census, commissioned by UKI and carried out by the University of Sheffield. And the reason these sorts of surveys exist is because there's a recognition that this data can't be gathered from existing sources in the same way. What the UKI study finds is mainly things about the composition of the workforce. It's not trying to find a total number of people that work there. And of course, there are particular reasons why they're carrying out the survey. UKI is an employers association. It's funded by video game companies in Britain and has particular objectives with what they want to find out. Of course, to make things even more complicated in Britain, there isn't just one employers association in the video games industry, there are two. There is also Tiger, which claims another figure, 20,000, different to the statistic, 43,000, different to some of the others that we might have found. And often what these surveys are about doing is not necessarily about finding out how many people work in the industry, but finding out about their contribution, how much money is being contributed to Britain's GDP. Now, of course, as a good Marxist who does some quantitative data, the first thing that I'm always interested in doing is dividing that 2.9 billion by 20,000 to have a think about the contribution of individual people to that. Of course, more complicated with things like Grand Theft Auto being made in studios all over the place. But what we see is a huge difference in ratio often between the size of the industry and its contribution. And so what do the statistics tell us? Well, in this case, they don't tell us a huge amount. They can't even tell us how many people work in the industry at Britain. And so what I want to do to make this about quantitative data is to think about what these statistics don't tell us. What's missing from the data? You know, if we were to do a project ourselves, what would we want to know about the industry and about the shape of the industry? And in particular, what I think is important about this is thinking about who funds surveys and why. The state, of course, funds a series of surveys, often to find out about how much tax should be paid, or what kind of opportunities there are for investment. UKI, Tiger fund these for similar reasons, to understand how the industry is changing, to think about how they can apply for further tax credits. There are particular reasons why this might happen. But all of these have particular interests behind them. There are no surveys carried out specifically to understand, you know, who the worst employer is or who you should avoid working for, or you know, these sorts of things that workers in the industry might want to know. Now, I'm going to try and connect this back to Marx. Does anybody know what this is a picture of?
Is it Assassin's Creed Syndicate?
It is Assassin's Creed Syndicate. Now, I played a lot of Assassin's Creed Syndicate for research purposes. Does that sound convincing? Yeah, for research purposes.
Does it work?
It was brilliant, yeah. Huge numbers of outputs from playing Assassin's Creed. In part because I live just around the corner from one of the major parts featured in the game. Whitechapel station, which you spend a bit of time going around, but also because something else happened in Assassin's Creed Syndicate. Has anybody played Assassin's Creed Syndicate? Oh gosh, okay, an unpopular game at Durham. One of the things that happens is we meet Marx, and I played this as part of writing a book about Marxism and video games, because I thought if you can meet a virtual Marx, this has got to be a great starting point for writing a book about video games. And in my research, my autoethnography, I thought I'd met Marx, and I thought, oh, this is brilliant. I've met Marx, I can start writing a book about it. It turned out to be Darwin. Similar beard, different politics perhaps. And eventually you meet Marx in a video game. And Marx asks you to do a number of things in the Assassin's Creed game. The first is he asks you to help him get to a political meeting. You can assassinate a number of cops along the way. The historical record is less clear on whether this takes place, but you do a number of these sort of side missions that are common in these kinds of open world games. But one of the missions, and I promise I'm getting to a point about quantitative data here, Marx asks you to meet him outside a factory. And you meet Marx outside this factory and he says, you know, what I really want to understand is what's happening in the factory. What are the working conditions like? You know, what should I know about factory work today? And he asks you to break into the factory. You scale a wall, climb in through a skylight, set fire to some hay bales, cause a general level of chaos, in order to steal some factory reports. Now, in reality, Marx went to the British Library and checked out factory reports. There were extensive factory reports at the time. He didn't, as far as we know, steal them. And he used these factory reports as a really important part of gathering quantitative data about what life was like in factories. He writes extensively about the length of the working day. He writes about the experience of buying bread for many workers that would be adulterated with bone and other things. And he had a kind of interest in trying to understand quantitative data. And if you follow through this, Marx is very grateful that you've stolen these reports to him. He says how important this is going to be for his projects. Tries to get the assassins to join the Communist Party. You don't have an option to accept or not, but you do get a nice red outfit that you can wear for the rest of the game, and some gold, imagine. But what's interesting about this is it echoes something that happens in Marx's life. And one of the things I'd love to do, although of course I can't talk about it in a quantitative session, is interview some of the developers to find out who wrote that part about Marx and what they were trying to say about it. It's often when we think about Marx, we don't think of somebody who was interested in quantitative data. We often don't think about somebody who was interested in primary data. And we don't think about him making a contribution to methodology around this. But what Marx does later in his life, in 1880, is he writes a survey. Now, how many of you have studied quantitative methods? Okay, it's 101 questions. Any problems with this? No, this is totally fine. He writes an incredibly long survey. It's 101 questions. And it goes into incredible detail about working conditions. He wants to know exactly what people do when they're at work, how they use machines, the kind of lighting in the factory, what happens when things go wrong, what their accommodation is like outside of the factory, how much they spend on tobacco, what happens if they don't pay their rent, you know, huge number of questions. And then the final part says, I realize I've written a lot of questions. I don't particularly want you to answer them all. You can if you want, but really what I want is for you to send me a letter and we can start a discussion about your work. And what this has for Marx is a kind of turn later in his life to thinking about what the experiences and lived experiences of people at work meant for his theorization in capital. The survey is kind of lost. It's put out first in a French newspaper, and for a long time there's no record of anyone ever filling it out, which makes it feel like a bit of a sad footnote in lots of ways. But more recently, a PhD student of mine has discovered that it was responded to in quite a lot of detail at the time. That people filled out parts of the questions. People wrote letters to Marx. A group of German miners filled out the survey, wanting to understand how then Belgium or other parts of Germany. And it gets taken up by a number of different groups, first in Poland, in the Netherlands, in Germany, in Italy, where people are trying to think about how you can use quantitative data as part of a process of collaborating on research with workers to understand what contribution quantitative data can make. Now, one of the places where it was never filled out is Italy. 3 different attempts were made to send the survey to people in Italy. Bundles of it were taken on trains. And each time the police confiscated it because they said it's too dangerous to have this survey distributed. So that's my kind of, if something's so dangerous to be distributed, it must have been worthwhile. And so this brings a kind of perspective on doing research, that we can use quantitative data as a starting point for making connections between researchers and workers, and then trying to do what Marx wanted, which was to have a form of co-research in which the researcher is no longer the expert, but is instead a participant in the research with people doing that research. Now, one part of this is trying to think about how work is changing. And what I liked about Poppy's presentation earlier is thinking about the role that ethnography can bring to thinking about work and working conditions. Sorry, about video games. Whereas I think we can also think about these approaches in terms of working conditions. One of the things about video games is they are made by people. Well, for now, mostly made by people. And they are made under particular conditions, with particular objectives and particular reasons for doing these sorts of things. And so the argument that I want to make in the rest of this talk is that we can take a bit of a step back from the play of video games to think about the work that goes into those video games. And one of the ways we can do this is by trying to draw on that quantitative data to build a picture of what happens behind the scenes of video games. Marx's ideas are taken up by various later groups, this idea of doing surveys as a starting point, to try and think about conditions of work and how that relates to understanding capitalism more widely. And so the approach that I've taken in my research is to think about what this means for class composition. Now, what I mean by class composition is the way in which our experience at work, the technical composition of our work, is related to our experiences outside of work, where we live, the kinds of communities we're part of, and how these two things shape the possibility of politics. And of course, we have an example of this happening in the universities right now. The way that university work is organized in particular ways leads to particular union forms and modes of activity, strikes, marking boycotts, and so on. But there is a connection between the organization of our work and the ways in which people try and struggle against their work. I realize this is probably more Marxism than you were expecting about quantitative data. But the point is that we can use quant data to think about a changing technical composition of video game work. And so the technical composition of video game work, there are fantastic ethnographies that talk about the experience in particular studios, the labor process that goes into making video games. But often these give us quite a narrow understanding, often of the more specialized and highly paid work that goes into making a game. Thinking here of Ergin Bullett's recent ethnography of a studio, gives a fantastic view of the creative processes that are happening, but perhaps doesn't include the ghost work and other forms of outsourcing that are required to do this. How we can get data on the technical composition of video games is things like the close connection to the military that many video game studios have. And thinking about how some of this data is hard to come by. How many of you know about licensing licensing guns in video games? One or two. How many of you know that if you buy a copy of Call of Duty, a part of the amount of the sticker price goes to an arms company so that you can play a realistic model of that video game? See, lots of these things aren't talked about, right? The technical details and technical data, because they're often shrouded in non-disclosure agreements, in the sorts of things that people who work in the military are much more used to doing. And so many of these relationships of development are difficult to find from the pure quant data from Census that we looked at earlier. It's hard to even know how many people are involved in the industry, how many companies are operating, or what relationships they have with each other. And part of this is thinking about the complexity of many of the relationships involved in video game work. Often when we talk about video game work, what we think of is somebody in a studio. There's probably table football. There's probably a fridge with energy drinks in it. We think of these kind of stereotypical images of what video game work looks like. And we don't think about the widespread use of quality assurance testing. We don't think about the material heavy manufacturing that plays a key role in the development of video games. And we look at the kinds of label we can see sort of above the visible line. The coders, the artists, the sound designers, and so on, and don't think about all the other kinds of work that happen below the surface. One of the important things about the quantitative data that is available is we're able to draw out a number of issues about the work and say that these are important and present issues in the video games industry. The first one is crunch time. From 2004 onwards, from the publishing of the EA Spouse letter, crunch has become an issue in the video games industry that's widely talked about. The IGDA survey always asks about crunch and tries to gather information about how widespread it is. We see different moments of public scandal where crunch reduces slightly and then returns to a previous peak afterwards. And part of this is thinking about why crunch happens. Often crunch is talked about as an aberration, as something that happens towards the end of a development cycle. It's a kind of management accident. Oh God, if only we could have planned better, we wouldn't have crunch. And I think here it's useful to return back to Marx to think about crunch, because crunch is an issue of extending the working day, something that Marx was very familiar with in a factory context. If you quantitatively extend the working day, you get more productivity from people. If you work 90 hours a week, this is much more than working the standard 37.5-hour week. And often what we find is that crunch becomes written into the budgeting of games. That games and production of games is hard to quantify in lots of ways. You can't say it will take exactly 3 years to make this game. There are problems that emerge. There are things that are difficult to measure in the work process. And so often crunch gets budgeted into these things. And I want to tell one very short story about crunch from a video game worker that I spoke to, just to illustrate how the kind of concrete effects that these things can have on people working in the industry. This person was working on a game, went through an intense period of crunch where they worked 90, sometimes 100-hour weeks. They slept in the office. They had a birthday during crunch, in which they took a 10-minute break to drink a beer at midnight with a colleague, and then went straight back to work. And then there was a decision made that the game was no longer going to meet the requirements of the investor, and so wasn't profitable to continue to the end of the development cycle. And so they found out one morning that the game was being canned and had to stop working on it. Now, their response to this was to spend the next 6 months watching cat videos at work on the internet because they were so burnt out from the process that they couldn't start work on something else. And so when we hear these stories of crunch, of how widespread they are, of how many hours people are working, it can be difficult to think of those effects on individual workers. The cost of not seeing family and friends, imagine having spent that long in an office. I mean, I can't even imagine spending a full working week in the office at the moment, let alone 90 to 100-hour weeks. But one of the challenges of this is anyone who has tried to do empirical work with video game workers often bumps up against this problem of non-disclosure agreements. How many of you have ever signed a non-disclosure agreement?
Can't tell you.
Very good. And so for lots of us, of course we can't reveal ourselves if we have, but for a lot of us, if we try to do an interview with somebody, we have to sign legal documents. For many workers in the industry, NDAs are part and parcel of working in the industry. And these are things that in general in Britain are not used in other industries. For example, no academic would ever sign a non-disclosure agreement to start work at a university. The idea that you couldn't disclose details of your work would be unheard of to some extent. But it's become a part of how video game work is organized, and it prevents many people talking about the experiences they have. Of course, originally these are in place to prevent you from leaking details about games, something that workers could have a lot of leverage over if they chose to use that as part of bargaining. But it means that qualitative data can often be quite hard to gather, or if it is possible to gather it, it's quite difficult to attribute it to something. And so here you can see why quantitative data can step into the gap a little bit. But it's possible to fill out a survey, even if you signed a non-disclosure agreement, to provide some details about how much crunch is happening without naming the company or risking being sued by an organization. Another important feature that we can think about video games work through quantitative data, and that's the social composition of this work, the way in which workers are composed outside of the workplace and how this affects the organization of the video games industry. Now, the first thing to say is the games industry, and this will be no surprise to those of you who study it, but the games industry has particular characteristics shaped by the fact, as Graham Kirkpatrick argues, people who work in the games industry are invariably invested in gaming as a cultural practice. Games are made by gamers, with all that implies. Now, of course, that implies quite a lot, as Graham argues, but when we dig into the data, we can find out aspects of the characteristics of the workforce in Britain. Now, the first thing to say is that diversity has long been an issue in the video games industry. But in Britain, there is a slight, not contradiction, but a slight difference in relationship to other industries more widely. The video games industry is overwhelmingly white in Britain. 80–90% white, which is not hugely different to the demographics in Britain overall, but a large proportion, almost a quarter of the British games industry, are that slightly awkward category of other white, which of course is white people not from Britain. So this is particularly from North America and from Europe. But minorities are underrepresented in the games industry, and even more so when you think that the majority of the games industry is in and around Greater London, which of course has a different ethnic makeup to the rest of the UK. So although it follows the national picture in terms of minorities, if you consider that these companies are mainly based in and around Greater London, there is a discrepancy in terms of who works in the industry. The video games industry is also overwhelmingly made up of people who identify as male, 67%. These dynamics have been changing over recent years. It's certainly not the case that historically there's been this composition in terms of gender in the video games industry. It's often been a much more male industry for a much longer time. And then, of course, there are some problems with this data, because this just tells us overall in the industry the composition of gender. It doesn't tell us the composition of gender based on job role. And so there are many roles that are much more male coded, and particularly in more senior roles. This has a number of important issues, and one of the claims that I want to make is that from the quantitative data on crunch, we can also say something about the data on diversity. And I'm sure we're probably familiar with the longer term gendering of the video games industry. I put one such obvious example up on the board. But to also think about how we can make a connection between the quantitative data on crunch and the quantitative data on diversity is, if you work in an industry with very long hours, it pushes people out of the industry who have caring responsibilities or family responsibilities. If you have an industry where people with caring and family responsibilities have been pushed out, it's much easier to force crunch on a workforce. If it's much easier to force crunch on a workforce, it comes back around to pushing people out of the industry. So you have a kind of self-reinforcing cycle between crunch and a lack of diversity in the industry. And the Yuki data that I was showing before highlights this quite extensively. The number of people with caring responsibilities in the industry is very low. It also means that the workforce is predominantly young. If people do have families, it's often harder to maintain those relationships, and people get pushed out of the industry. It means that those conditions around work, in terms of a purely kind of contractual issue around working hours, goes on to have much bigger effects on the kind of industry, the shape of the industry, and then, of course, the kinds of games and representations that are featured in that media that end up with us having Game Boy as one way of talking about this sort of thing. Okay, so the final part that I want to get on to, which is an actual quantitative project that I've been involved in, just to make it look like I'm not bluffing about quants, is the political composition of video game work. So a lot of my research in the video games industry has been about trying to understand how the shape of the industry, and then the conditions under which people come into the industry, how they live outside of the industry, shapes the politics of video game workers. And part of this has been an ethnography with the game workers branch of the IWGB trade union, which was the first video game union in Britain, which has been established over the past 5 years or so. So this is a kind of longer project with video game workers to understand why they started organizing and what the implications could be for the games industry more widely. And the project that we put together is a project with myself, with a video game worker from Britain and a video game worker from the US, to try and map collective action in the video games industry. What the project does is crowdsources actions that video game workers have been taking. Any action that involves 2 or more people trying to change their working conditions. So it can't just be one person, it has to be more than one. And if you're familiar at all with the stories around this, you'll see that there is a huge spike from 2018, which is the formation of Game Workers Unite, and then a kind of consistent number of events happening. But one of the things we wanted to do was to try and retell through quantitative data the longer story of video game worker organizing. And so there are a number of different moments where things have happened in the video games industry. And then, of course, because we wanted to also play a game, finding the earliest ever event in the video games industry in which people did something collective to try and change their conditions. Now, I still think Austin cheated a bit with this one, because there were no video games in 1955. There was, of course, Nintendo in 1955 that made playing cards. And when they shut one of their factories, workers occupied the factory to make sure they got proper redundancy pay. So the earliest ever event is 1955. But it depends how you conceive of this as the video games industry. This is what the what the website looks like. It maps actions across the world and then provides different ways to filter those actions. There is a submission form that people can add their own events to, and then amongst the project team, we try and keep an eye on the news and think about things that are happening and add details to it. What I'd like to suggest we do, rather than me pointing at things and trying to explain it to you, is let you have a bit of a poke around on the website and have a think about the data. It's gameworkersolidarity.com, I'm hoping. But if you Google Game Worker Solidarity, it should come up. And I want you to have a look at the data, play around with some of the filters, and have a think about how this confirms or changes your opinions of the industry. There are particular kinds of actions that happen in response to particular kinds of things, particular regions where more things are happening. But I want you to have a bit of a dig through the data, have a look at it, and then we'll come back for a bit of a discussion before we finish up. Okay, so hopefully you've had a bit of a chance to poke around at the data, genuine quantitative data. Any questions, comments, thoughts? What sort of things have you found on the website?
Activation Blizzard got any tips on how UCU could get $1 million crowdfunding?
Well, quite right, eh? They did really, really well with the crowdfunder. But I think you also need to have colleagues with lots of money, right? I think that helps. Yeah.
I'm Korean,
Yeah.
so I looked at Korea and it was quite interesting because it's a small country, but there were 10 actions
Yeah.
compared to other, like Japan has a lot, and it's a big industry, but they only had one. So that was interesting.
Yeah, and I actually think there's a lot more in Korea. You might notice that there is a lot of stuff in countries where English is the main spoken language. But a Korean researcher has started looking things up, but they tend to all be in Korean-only news sources. So I'm sure there's more in China to be added. Yeah, but yeah, it's a really good point. Yeah.
When you talked earlier about the way in which video games, because it potentially sits in a variety of different industries and it's like horses of crack, looking through this, it seems we get a similar sort of issue around organising, right? Because obviously you've got equity in the UK, and when it comes to voice acting, I've been I don't really know, but it doesn't seem that the WGA, right, because either in Britain or in the US, covers video games in particular. I don't know if that's just because it's not a unionised workforce or they just don't cover it. So you seem to be getting this issue where for organising, it's falling both in the kind of tech side, as it were, and the creative side, as it were, and existing organising structures aren't mapping onto it in the same way that existing operationalization of data collection isn't fitting what video games are.
Yeah, and that's something that really comes out from the American example, right? That video game workers are in the communication workers of America, and voice actors are in SAG-AFTRA, but there's no Writers Guild things around video game workers. And part of this is the kind of an industry that's born out of relationships with other industries. Is one of the first proper strikes in the video games industry is of voice actors who had been part of the actors union that had been involved in industrial action. So you end up with these connections that get formed across, but also if you're a video games writer, I don't know what the Writers Guild of Britain, I can never remember the exact version here, but
I looked it up, it's just a vaguely multimedia writing.
Yeah, which is not super clear on what they would be able to do. Any other points or questions? Okay, so a couple of things to say just before we finish up. So the first thing is that we can start to draw out trends that are happening. And over the past year, the biggest trend that's been happening is union recognition votes in the US. So these are NLRB, National Labour Relations Board elections that have been happening in huge numbers. Now, these haven't been happening in Britain because you don't need to do this in Britain. You can just join a union if you're in a workplace and you're a member of that union. And so what we start to see is differences coming about through the national context. But it looks like lots is happening in the US because there are visible moments where things are happening. Whereas you're not going to get a visible moment in Britain every time a video game worker joins a union. That the majority of actions have been around the formation of unions. There are still very few collective bargaining agreements. There are still very few strikes that have happened in the industry. And actually the majority of strikes that have happened have been of journalists. Because the digital games journalism sector unionized quite early on, which to be honest, if we want a tip for UCU, it would be to get people who write about higher education unionized and keen on what we're doing and telling everyone that unions are great. This has really helped the video games industry. You know, media is full of positive articles about joining unions and what they can do. This is a rarity in any other sector of the economy. It's usually the opposite. And so part of this is about, one of the other kinds of research that I do is not say I'm not really a video games researcher, but really I do a lot of research on collective organizing and unions, is to think about how this quantitative data can contribute to arguments around unions, how unions operate, the challenges facing unions, and what's happening in the industry. And this is a data set that I couldn't have put together on my own. I don't know enough about the video games industry to do this. I can't be globally watching over everything that happens, but instead to find video game workers who wanted to do this because they were part of a movement in which they were worried about losing this data, that so much was happening in the last 2, 3, 4 years that there was a fear that this data would be lost. They'd forget the things that had happened. And so to live archive it in a quantitative project like this is both important for workers who are organizing, important for people who want to find out more about it, but can also have academic objectives. You know, it can help contribute to wider debates on union models. We've also made all of the data open access. It's based off an Airtable table, I guess is what you would describe it as, that then pulls through to this map. And so on the website, you can pull up the Airtable, you can see all of the data. And so, of course, this has some ethical concerns and issues of making sure there's sign-off from people involved in the activities, that people are happy with what's being shared. But what we really hope with this project is that other people find uses for it that we didn't imagine at first, that use it for different projects or find ways to reuse it, because it's ultimately not data that we own, right? This is about people's experiences and the struggles they've been involved in and contributing to a collective resource. So what I want to finish on with the remaining couple of minutes is just to think about why and how it can be useful to use data in thinking about video games. And I guess one of the arguments that I want to make in this seminar is it's important that we understand about the play of video games, that we can do ethnographies of gameplay, that we can understand how games are interpreted by people, but that we also need to draw attention to how games are made, but the conditions under which games are made and the ways in which people who make those games respond to or are treated by management in different ways has a powerful effect on the kinds of games that we play, but also the kinds of games that we're not able to play, the games that didn't make it through production, the ideas that were stopped for one reason or another. And that can help us think more about our own gameplay, to kind of draw attention to the people behind the scenes in video games, and helps us build a more materialist analysis of video game play, where we think about the embodied experiences, but we also think about the structural forces shaping the industry. And I think it's a really exciting time to be thinking about quantitative data in the industry, because you can look at these new examples of unions, of strikes, of collective action, which hasn't been a long-term feature of the industry. And it's rare, as someone who studies unions, to see in real time a union movement developing and see the challenges that it's facing and how people overcome it in different ways. But the whole picture wouldn't be possible to gather just by interviewing people involved in game worker organizing, because this is an increasingly global phenomenon with very differentiated experiences. And so the argument that I want to finish on is to say you might think quants is boring. I certainly know that my methods students on a Monday morning think quants is boring, but we can think of alternative and critical ways to use quantitative data that don't leave it only to government reports or company commissioned surveys, that can do something much more radical and progressive of sharing stories and examples of what's happening in one place or another, and encourage more people to get involved in things like organizing in the games industry. Thank you very much.